Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the world of the prophets. If we go to the ancient world and just see a map of where Africa and Europe and Asia are connected, and then focus on that very narrow area that takes in what we call the Middle East, there we come, and here we're just zooming in on that map. We find an area that has become known as an area of relative fertility, and because of that, it was nicknamed back in the 1800s the Fertile Crescent. And that's a good name for it. That's not to say that it's all lush and green, but compared to the desert area surrounding it, there is, if you use your imagination just a little bit, a crescent-shaped area from the Nile River to Mesopotamia, that is the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris. Now, this area, like I said, you have Mesopotamia in the east and Egypt in the west. The two ends of our crescent became the areas where civilization grew up from a very early age. We're not going to go all the way back to that era. We do notice that between those areas of Mesopotamia and Egypt, there was something like a land bridge with the ocean on one side and the desert on the other. And if you wanted to go from Mesopotamia or the land of the Hittites in the North Hatti down to Egypt, you crossed over this land bridge, and this took you through the land of Canaan. Now, in the Bible, we see the Israelites coming into the land of Canaan, but then, and they are for a number of years independent tribes, the tribes of Israel, but they don't have a lot of unity until the coming of the kings, the period of Saul and David and Solomon. And with those kings, you begin to have, especially by the time you get to David's later reign and Solomon, you begin to have a unified kingdom, a kingdom of Israel. It doesn't last all that long. Now, remember, you have, Egypt and Assyria, and it's Egypt and the lands to the east in Mesopotamia, these two, great areas, great kingdoms. And it's in the middle of this that David has his little tiny kingdom of Israel, first Saul and then David. Under Solomon, it is extended considerably from the Red Sea to the south all the way to the Euphrates. That's not to say that all the kings that are in those areas just disappear, but they're all becoming what we would call maybe vassal kings to Solomon, so that his authority and his influence is extended to those areas. However, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom splits up into two kingdoms, so that now you have Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Uh, the capital of Judah is now going to be Jerusalem. The capital of Israel will initially be a place called Shechem, with its new places of worship. Instead of worshiping in Jerusalem, two alternate places of worship will be set up, one at Bethel and one at Dan. The first capital is going to be Shechem, but eventually we'll see a new capital city in Israel, and it will be the city of Samaria, and the government will eventually move here. And the prophets will refer to Samaria both as a city as well as that which represents the entire area of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, back in the early days of the Israelites, you'd had Moses and Joshua who had brought the people out of Egypt and into the promised land, and this had been a time of great miracles. And then this also saw the time, first with Moses and then with Joshua, you have the writing of the Torah. And you say, well, Joshua involved in the writing of the Torah? Well, somebody comes along and finishes the Torah, because the Torah ends with the death of Moses. I don't think he wrote that, so somebody comes along after him and completes his work. And so now you have those first five books, the books of Moses, we call them, because he's largely the author of that, and he's one of the certainly the key character throughout most of those books. Um, but then we have the period of the judges, and we have already mentioned Saul and David and Solomon. And although there are scattered writings, for example, David is writing many songs that are eventually going to be in the Psalms, they're not collected yet. And until we get to the days of Elijah and Elisha. And again, now is a period of great miracles. You don't see a lot of miracles in the days of Saul or David or Solomon. I'm not saying that God doesn't work, but there aren't those great sign miracles where you'd had the Red Sea parting and the earth opening up at one point and the sun standing still. But now with the coming of Elijah and Elisha, again, you begin to see these great miracles taking place. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes the sacrifice in the days of Elijah. And the dead are even raised to life. And there are healings and there are all sorts of signs from heaven during the ministry of Elijah and Elisha. After their ministry, we begin to see new prophets. There had been prophets before, but these new prophets are now writing scriptures. And so these are not just the prophets, these are the written prophets, and those are the ones we're going to be studying in our series. Now, these prophets of the divided kingdom, now that we're getting into written prophets, and I said these come after Elijah and Elisha. These are Isaiah, and then Hosea and Joel. We think Joel was around this time. We're not absolutely sure. Amos and Micah. These are all prophets of this divided kingdom. And of course, the prophets of the divided kingdom are living in a day when you have Assyria in the east, and Assyria is the big enemy of Israel and Judah. Egypt is still not really a superpower anymore, sort of a second-rate power. And it's the prophet Jonah that goes to Assyria and prophesies in Nineveh. And there's a wonderful story of God's compassion that takes place there. Assyria eventually comes against Israel in the year 721 BC, and the northern kingdom of Israel is taken into captivity. In that year, the city of Samaria falls and is destroyed and has never been rebuilt. If you go to the site of the city of Samaria today, you need to get permission because it's somebody's farmland. You need to get permission to go and just look at some of the rubble that's still there. Assyria finally is going to meet its end in the year 612 BC when Babylon and the Medes actually form a confederation. The Scythians sort of enter into this loosely. They're not really confederated. They're just taking advantage of the situation. And in the year 612 BC, Nineveh is captured and destroyed, and the Assyrian Empire, such as it was, has ceased to exist. The remnants run to the west, and they make their stand at Carchemish, where they are going to be met from Egypt by a Pharaoh Necho, who comes up through Megiddo. Some things happen there that we'll talk about in a later series. And at Carchemish, they make their last stand against this confederation, especially against the king of Babylon, who wins the battle for who's going to rule the world. Following the Battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar, he's the crown prince of Babylon. He's been leading the armies. He comes down, chasing the Egyptians back to their homeland, but he also comes down to the kingdom of Judah. And now Judah becomes part of this Babylonian arena. And so it's at this time that we see the prophets of Judah. It's not that they start with Nebuchadnezzar, but it's leading up to this entire series. And the prophets Jeremiah and Habakkuk and Zephaniah are all prophets of the single kingdom of Judah. Israel's long been since taken into exile. And so these are the prophets of Judah, where Judah is standing alone, facing eventually the coming of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. Nahum had been a prophet of the destruction of Nineveh. He had prophesied in his prophecy how Nineveh would be destroyed, and it was fulfilled just the way that he had prophesied. And we also see in this period Obadiah, who is given a prophecy directed toward Edom, but in the face of Nebuchadnezzar's coming into that area. And the people of Edom are warned, don't you take advantage of the situation to go and plunder the kingdom of Judah as Nebuchadnezzar has conquered it and is taking his people into captivity. That's my judgment, God sort of says, against Judah. Don't you enter into it, or else I'm coming after you. Next, we have the prophets of the exile, and of course, Daniel and Ezekiel are the prophets of the exile, while the people of Judah, even the Jewish people, have been taken into exile to Babylon. However, after Babylon, after Nebuchadnezzar has died, Babylon's not going to last very long because remember we talked about the Medes who had entered into an alliance with them earlier, but now the Medes and the Persians have formed a partnership. Actually, they've got one king, according to tradition, is part Mede and part Persian, and he advances first against the Lydians, but then he comes against Babylon itself. And according to his records, takes it without a fight. And so the Babylonian Empire that had been so powerful just disappears with a whimper. And when it does, this new king, Cyrus the Great, he's kings of the Medes and the Persians, he has a policy that all the people that have been dispossessed, like the Jews, are now granted permission to go back home and resettle and build their cities and build their temples. And this brings about now the period of what we call the post-exilic prophets, Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi. And their prophecy is taking place during this period of the Medes and the Persians, as the Medes and the Persians have instituted an empire, and little Judah is part of that empire. And they are prophesying during this period. And that brings the Old Testament period to a close, but the story does not end there. A couple of hundred years later, we see in the year 333 BC, Alexander the Great, this brand new young king from Macedonia in northern Greece, sets out on a world conquest. In a space of 10 years, he marches all the way to India. And then he comes back to Babylon where he dies. He's only 33 years old. He dies. And as he lies on his deathbed, his generals gather around him and ask, "To whom are you going to give your kingdom?" And he whispers out, "To the strongest," which means that his generals just grab his kingdom and break it into all sorts of pieces. The two pieces that we're interested in are two of those generals. Ptolemy takes control of Egypt, and Seleucus takes the area of Syria. Initially, kingdoms going all the way to India, but the part that we're interested is here in the king to the north, and he's actually called in the Bible the king of the north, the king to the north of little tiny Judah. And in the middle of these two kings and kingdoms is the little tiny kingdom of Judah, which is a little bit like a ping pong ball going back and forth between these two kings that more often than not are at war with each other. Now, the plot thickens when a king comes to the throne of the Seleucid kingdom named Antiochus, and he gets the nicknames Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Magnificent. I think he gave himself that name. The Jews called him by a different name. They called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus the Madman. And you begin to see why they called him that when you realize what he did to the Jews. You see, Antiochus Epiphanes went into the Jewish temple and ordered a statue of himself to be placed in the Holy of Holies. It was an abomination that rendered the temple completely desolate. And the book of Daniel had prophesied this event, had given it that title, the abomination of desolation that would be set up in the holy place. And sure enough, that prophecy was fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes. However, the Jews didn't stand still for that, and eventually a rebellion broke out against Antiochus, and it was led by a family group, a family known as the Hasmoneans. They got the nickname the Maccabees. The word Maccabee is Aramaic, also a Hebrew word, means the hammer, because they hammered the Seleucids. Not that they destroyed the entire Seleucid Empire, but they did hammer out their independence. And so Judah became, for a time, an independent country, recognized by the surrounding countries and even recognized by far off Rome. However, it was Rome also that brought an end to this. In the year 63 BC, Pompey, one of the Roman generals, came down against Judah. He'd been invited by some of the descendants of those Maccabean kings, and Pompey came down at that invitation and conquered Judah, changed its name to Judea, and Judea now became a Roman province. Ruled this Roman province a series of first procurators, and eventually one was made by the Romans king, and this was Herod. Herod the Great was made a king of the Jews. After the death of Herod, we have a series of procurators ruling Judea. Of course, Herod had been still alive at the birth of Jesus. But by the time Jesus comes into his ministry, now Judea is being ruled by procurators. Their job was to procure taxes and send them to Rome. And so we had already talked about how in the days of Moses and Joshua, you had miracles, and that led to the writing of the Torah. And then Elijah and Elisha, you'd had a period of great miracles. But after their ministry, even though you had the prophets writing, you don't have a lot. I'm not going to say you don't have any, but you don't have a lot in the way of those great and glorious miracles. God is still working. He's still present. He's answering prayers, but not those great sign miracles until you come to Jesus and to his apostles. And this begins a new period of miracles. And it also leads to a new series of writings. We'll cover these in a separate class, but you have the writing of the New Testament, the Gospels and the book of Acts and the epistles, and finally topped off by the book of Revelation. And of course, the high point in the Gospels is the fact that Jesus not only comes and dies on the cross, but he rises from the dead. That was the greatest miracle of all, the miracle of miracles, the resurrection of Jesus, whereby God showed that this was indeed the Messiah, the anointed one, the one that had been promised all throughout the Old Testament. However, the Jewish people as a people had not accepted the Messiah. And so it was that in the year 70 AD, I think we see a sign of God's judgment, and you actually see a sign if you go to this picture of the Arch of Titus in Rome. And if you go there, it is a arch that commemorates the taking of the Jewish people, the collapse of Judea, the destruction of the Jewish temple. Go inside the arch, and here on one side of the arch, you actually see people that are carrying off some of the furniture from the temple. You can see a picture of the lampstand from the temple in this engraving to show how God had brought judgment against those who had rejected his Messiah. Now, that's not to say that they all rejected him, because remember, the early church was exclusively Jewish. It just took a while before they even brought Gentiles in. But God's judgment and his prophetic word had come to pass. Now, that's not the end of the story, because the story hasn't ended. You see, there's more prophecy, not to come, but the prophecy of what is to come, and that is that Jesus is going to return one day. And when he does, that will be the end of the story.